Broken long silence. Clementine Clem Dawson had spent years trying to forget Jesse Slade, the gunslinger who left her with nothing but a broken heart. But when he rode into town dust-covered, dangerous, and looking at her like he never stopped wanting her, she knew trouble had finally come home. He leaned against the saloon door, his voice a slow drawl. "You still mad at me, darlin'?" he murmured. "Or just mad that you still want me?" Chapter 1. The dust settles. The heart remembers. The late afternoon sun cast long, skeletal shadows across the dusty main street of Redemption, Arizona. A town Clementine Dawson often thought ironically named. There was little redemption to be found here, only the slow, steady march of time, etching lines on faces and hearts alike. Clem stood on the weathered porch of her general store, a sturdy, two-story building that had been in her family for 3 generations. It was the heart of Redemption, a place where folks came for supplies, gossip, and a momentary respite from the harsh realities of the frontier. She was watching the dust devils dance in the distance, a familiar ballet of grit and wind, when a lone rider appeared on the horizon. Her breath hitched, a small, involuntary gasp that betrayed the calm she'd cultivated over the years. There was something in the way the rider sat his horse, a casual arrogance, a dangerous grace, that sent a shiver of recognition down her spine. A shiver she hadn't felt in 15 long years. Clem was no longer the naive girl she'd been, the one who'd fallen head over heels for the charming outlaw with eyes the color of a stormy sky. She was 47 now, her auburn hair streaked with silver, her face tanned and weathered by the sun, her hands calloused from years of hard work. She'd buried a husband, raised a daughter now married and living in Tucson, and built a life for herself, brick by painstaking brick. A life she'd thought was finally, blessedly, peaceful. But the rider was drawing closer, and the knot in her stomach tightened with each beat of her heart. It couldn't be. It just couldn't. But even from this distance she knew. The way he held his head, the tilt of his hat, the way his worn leather duster billowed in the wind, it was him. Jesse Slade. The man who had stolen her heart and then vanished like smoke in the wind, leaving her with nothing but a shattered dream and a lifetime of regret. She gripped the porch railing, her knuckles white, her gaze fixed on the approaching figure. He was closer now, close enough for her to see the details. The lines etched around his eyes, the silver threading through his dark hair, the familiar scar above his left eyebrow, a souvenir from a bar fight in Tombstone she'd foolishly tried to stop. He was older, harder, but undeniably him. The same raw magnetism that had drawn her in as a young woman was still there, a palpable force that made the air crackle around him. He reined in his horse, a magnificent black stallion, just in front of the store. The dust swirled around them, a hazy curtain that momentarily obscured him. When it settled, he was looking at her, his eyes, those unforgettable stormy gray eyes, locking onto hers with an intensity that made her breath catch in her throat. He dismounted, slow and deliberate, every movement radiating a controlled power that both terrified and fascinated her. He looped the reins around the hitching post, his gaze never leaving hers. He walked towards her, each step measured, each step bringing him closer to the life he'd abandoned, the woman he'd left behind. He stopped at the foot of the porch steps, looking up at her. The years melted away, and for a fleeting moment, she was that young girl again, breathless and captivated by the dangerous outlaw who had ridden into her life. He leaned against one of the porch supports, his posture relaxed, but his eyes held a glint of something she couldn't quite decipher. Amusement? Regret? Or something far more dangerous? He tipped his hat, a slow, deliberate gesture, and a familiar smile, the one that used to make her heart flutter, played on his lips. "Clementine," he said, his voice a low, husky drawl that sent shivers down her spine. It was a voice she'd heard in her dreams countless times, a voice that had haunted her waking hours. It was a voice she'd tried, and failed, to forget. She swallowed hard, trying to find her own voice, the voice of the strong, independent woman she'd become. But the words caught in her throat, choked by a mixture of anger, resentment, and a treacherous, undeniable flicker of something she thought she'd buried long ago. "Jessie," she finally managed, her voice a raspy whisper, barely audible above the whisper of the wind. It was a name she hadn't spoken aloud in years, a name that tasted like ashes and lost dreams. He pushed himself off the support, taking a step closer, invading her space, her carefully constructed world. The scent of him leather, dust, and something indefinably masculine filled her senses, stirring up memories she'd fought so hard to suppress. "You still mad at me, darlin'?" he murmured, his voice a silken caress that belied the steel beneath. His eyes searched hers, probing, questioning, challenging. "Or just mad that you still want me?" The audacity of the question, the sheer arrogance of it, snapped something inside her. The years of hurt, the betrayal, the unanswered questions, all boiled to the surface. She straightened her shoulders, meeting his gaze head-on, the fire of defiance burning in her eyes. "I haven't thought about you in years, Jessie," she lied, her voice gaining strength. "You're nothing but a ghost, a faded memory." He chuckled, a low, rumbling sound that sent another shiver down her spine, this one not entirely unpleasant. "Is that so, Clem? Then why is your heart beating like a hummingbird's wings?" He reached out, his hand hovering just inches from her cheek, close enough for her to feel the warmth radiating from his skin. She flinched, but didn't pull away. The air between them crackled with unspoken tension, a potent mixture of anger, desire, and the ghosts of a past that refused to stay buried. A past that had just ridden back into town, stirring up the dust and the memories, threatening to shatter the fragile peace she had so painstakingly built. And in his eyes, she saw not just the ghost of the man she'd loved, but the shadow of the trouble he inevitably brought with him. The trouble that always followed Jessie Slade, like a loyal, deadly dog. She knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that his return meant more than just a rekindling of old flames. It meant danger, and she was standing right in the heart of it. Chapter 2. Ghosts in the Twilight Saloon. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of fiery orange and bruised purple. The twilight deepened, casting long shadows that stretched and distorted the familiar shapes of redemption. Clem watched Jessie from the window of her store, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, a knot of unease twisting in her stomach. He'd unsaddled his horse and was now leading it towards the livery stable, his movements fluid and graceful, even after what must have been a long ride. She'd offered him nothing, not even a glass of water. He hadn't asked. Their exchange on the porch had been brief, charged with unspoken emotions, and ultimately unresolved. He'd simply tipped his hat again, that infuriatingly charming smile still playing on his lips, and said, "I'll be seeing you, Clem. This town ain't big enough for both of us to avoid each other for long." And he was right. Redemption was a small town, a speck of civilization clinging to the edge of the vast, unforgiving desert. Everyone knew everyone else's business, and secrets were as rare as rain. Jessie's return was already the talk of the town, the whispers spreading faster than a prairie fire. She sighed, turning away from the window. She needed to close up the store, but her usual routine felt disrupted, her thoughts scattered like tumbleweeds in the wind. She couldn't shake the image of him, the way he'd looked at her, the way his voice had wrapped around her like a familiar, forgotten melody. She forced herself to focus, locking the doors, checking the inventory, the mundane tasks a welcome distraction from the turmoil inside her. But even as she went through the motions, her mind kept replaying their encounter, analyzing every word, every gesture, every flicker of emotion in his eyes. Finally, she extinguished the lamps, plunging the store into darkness. She stepped out onto the porch, locking the door behind her. The town was settling into its usual evening rhythm. The sounds of laughter and music drifted from the Golden Nugget Saloon, the only establishment in Redemption that stayed open late. A sudden impulse seized her. She needed to see him again, to confront him, to demand answers, to understand why, after all these years, he had chosen to return. She couldn't let him just waltz back into her life and disrupt everything she'd worked so hard to build. She started walking towards the saloon, her boots crunching on the dusty street. The closer she got, the louder the sounds became, the raucous laughter, the clinking of glasses, the tinny piano music. She hesitated at the entrance, her hand hovering over the swinging doors. The saloon was Jessie's world, not hers. She'd always avoided it, preferring the quiet solitude of her home and the predictable routine of her store. But tonight, something had shifted. Tonight, she was drawn to the darkness, to the danger, to the man who embodied both. She pushed open the doors and stepped inside. The saloon was dimly lit, smoky, and crowded. The air was thick with the smell of whiskey, sweat, and stale tobacco. Cowboys, miners, and ranchers jostled for space at the bar and the few scattered tables. A haze of smoke hung in the air, obscuring the faces in the back of the room. Her eyes scanned the crowd, searching for him. It didn't take long. He was sitting at a table in a corner, a bottle of whiskey and 2 glasses in front of him. He was alone, his back to the wall, his eyes surveying the room with a wary alertness that spoke of a life lived on the edge. He saw her then, his gaze locking onto hers across the crowded room. He didn't smile, didn't wave, didn't make any gesture of acknowledgement. He simply held her gaze, his eyes unreadable in the dim light. Clem felt a tremor run through her, a mixture of fear and anticipation. She walked towards him, her steps slow and deliberate, her head held high. The other patrons watched her, their conversations dying down as she passed. They knew who she was and they knew who he was. They knew the history, the unspoken story that hung between them like a loaded gun. She reached his table and stood there, looking down at him. He didn't rise, didn't offer her a seat. He simply poured a generous amount of whiskey into one of the glasses and pushed it across the table towards her. "Sit down, Clem," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "Unless you're planning on standing there all night, staring at me like I'm some kind of ghost." She hesitated for a moment, then pulled out the chair opposite him and sat down. She picked up the glass, her hand trembling slightly, and took a sip. The whiskey burned a fiery trail down her throat, but it steadied her nerves. "Why are you here, Jessie?" she asked, her voice steady now, devoid of the earlier tremor. "After all these years, why come back?" He leaned back in his chair, his eyes studying her face, searching for something. "Maybe I missed you," he said, his voice soft, almost a whisper. She scoffed, a harsh, disbelieving sound. "Don't play games with me, Jessie. You never missed anyone in your life. You only ever cared about yourself." He didn't deny it. He simply shrugged, a slight movement of his shoulders. "Maybe I've changed," he said. "Outlaws don't change," she retorted, her voice sharp. "They just get older and more dangerous." He smiled then, a slow, cynical smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Maybe you're right," he said. "But I'm not the same man I was 15 years ago, Clem. I've seen things, done things that would make your hair curl." She met his gaze, unflinching. "I'm not afraid of you, Jessie," she said. "Not anymore." He raised an eyebrow, a flicker of amusement in his eyes. "Is that so? Then why are you here, Clem? Why did you come looking for me?" She hesitated, searching for the right words, the right way to explain the tangled emotions that had driven her here. I needed to know," she finally said. "I needed to know why you left. Why you never came back." He took a long swallow of his whiskey, his eyes never leaving hers. "Some things are better left buried, Clem," he said softly. "Some ghosts are best left undisturbed. But they're not buried, are they, Jessie?" she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "They're right here, in this room, sitting between us." He looked at her for a long moment, his eyes filled with a sadness she hadn't seen before, a weariness that spoke of a life lived on the run, a life filled with regrets. And in that moment, she saw a glimpse of the man he might have been, the man she'd once loved, the man buried beneath layers of hardened cynicism and outlaw grit. A man who might, just might, be capable of change. But the doubt lingered, a cold shadow in the back of her mind. He was still Jesse Slade, the outlaw. And outlaws always brought trouble. The question was, could she survive it this time? Could her heart? The piano player started a new song, a slow, mournful ballad, and the melody seemed to wrap around them, weaving a tapestry of lost love and unspoken longing. The air hung heavy with the weight of their past, a past that was both a burden and a bond. And Clem knew, with a sinking feeling, that she was far from finished with Jesse Slade. Chapter 3. A bargain struck in Gunsmoke. The mournful ballad ended, and the saloon returned to its usual cacophony. Clem pushed the half-empty whiskey glass away, the fiery liquid doing little to soothe the turmoil within her. Jesse watched her, his expression unreadable. The silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken questions and unresolved emotions. "I didn't come back here to cause you trouble, Clem," Jesse finally said, his voice low and serious. "I know I hurt you, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise. But I'm not here to stir up the past." "Then why are you here?" Clem pressed, her gaze unwavering. "You don't just ride into a town you abandoned 15 years ago without a reason. Especially not this town." He leaned forward, his forearms resting on the table, his eyes boring into hers. "I need your help," he said. The words hung in the air, unexpected and unsettling. Clem stared at him, disbelief etched on her face. "My help? You're asking me for help?" He nodded, a slight, almost imperceptible movement of his head. "I know it's a lot to ask, considering everything. But you're the only person in this town I can trust." Clem laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. "Trust? You left me without a word, Jesse. You disappeared into the night and never looked back. And now you're talking about trust?" "I know," he said, his voice rough with regret. "And I don't expect you to forgive me. But I need your help, Clem. It's a matter of life and death." His words sent a chill down her spine. She'd known his return would bring trouble, but she hadn't anticipated this. She studied his face, searching for any sign of deception, any hint that he was playing her. But his eyes were serious, his expression grim. "What kind of help?" she asked, her voice cautious. He glanced around the saloon, ensuring no one was within earshot. He leaned closer, lowering his voice even further. "There's a man, Sheriff Brody. He's corrupt, Clem. He's been using his position to run a smuggling operation, bringing in illegal goods from Mexico." Clem frowned. She'd heard rumors about Brody, whispers of shady dealings and unexplained wealth. But she'd never had any concrete proof. "What does that have to do with you?" "I was involved," Jesse admitted, his voice barely a whisper. "A few years back, I was part of his gang. I didn't know the full extent of his operation at the time. I thought it was just a few harmless robberies. But it was much bigger, much dirtier." "And you want to stop him now?" Clem asked, her voice skeptical. He nodded. "I got out, Clem. I walked away. But I know too much. He's been hunting me ever since. He knows I'm a threat to him. So you came here, to redemption, to hide?" "Not to hide," Jesse corrected. "To fight back. I have proof, Clem. Evidence that can bring him down. But I need your help to get it to the right people." Clem hesitated. This was dangerous, far more dangerous than she'd anticipated. Getting involved with Jesse again, even in this capacity, was like stepping into a viper's nest. But there was something in his eyes, a desperation, a plea for help that she couldn't ignore. "What do you need me to do?" she asked, her voice resigned. He smiled, a flicker of relief crossing his face. "I have the evidence hidden outside of town. I need you to retrieve it for me. Brody's men are watching me. They know I'm here. They'll be looking for any opportunity to take me down. But they won't suspect you." "And where is this evidence?" Clem inquired, already feeling the weight of the task settling on her shoulders. Jesse reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper. He slid it across the table to her. "It's a map," he said. "It shows the location of a hidden cache near the old abandoned silver mine, north of town." Clem unfolded the map, her eyes scanning the crude drawing. It was a simple sketch, showing a few landmarks and a marked location near a cluster of rocks. "I'll go in the morning," she stated, her tone decisive, surprising even herself. She hadn't consciously decided to help him. The decision felt like it had risen from somewhere deep within, a residual loyalty, a stubborn refusal to let injustice prevail, even if it involved the man who had broken her heart. Jesse nodded, his gaze filled with gratitude. "Thank you, Clem. I owe you one." "You owe me more than one, Jesse," she said, her voice hard. "But this isn't about what you owe me. This is about doing what's right." He looked at her, a flicker of admiration in his eyes. "You haven't changed, Clem," he said softly. "You're still the same strong, stubborn woman I remember." She met his gaze, her heart aching with a mixture of resentment and a lingering, undeniable affection. He was right. She hadn't changed. But neither had he, not entirely. He was still the outlaw, still living on the edge, still drawing her into his dangerous world. But this time, she was going in with her eyes open, aware of the risks, prepared for the consequences. He stood up, extending his hand to her. "Walk with me," he said. "It's not safe for you to be seen with me for too long." She took his hand, his touch sending a jolt of electricity through her. They walked out of the saloon together, side by side, into the cool night air. The town was quiet now, the only sounds the distant howl of a coyote and the soft crunch of their boots on the dusty street. They walked in silence, the unspoken tension between them a palpable force. As they reached the front of her store, he stopped. "Be careful, Clem," he said, his voice low and urgent. "Brody is a dangerous man. Don't underestimate him." She nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. "I won't," she said. He looked at her for a long moment, his eyes searching hers. Then, before she could react, he leaned down and kissed her, a brief, fleeting touch of his lips to hers. It was a kiss of gratitude, a kiss of farewell, a kiss that stirred up 1,000 buried emotions. He pulled away, his eyes still locked on hers. "Until tomorrow," he whispered. Then he turned and walked away, disappearing into the darkness, leaving her standing there alone, with the taste of whiskey and regret on her lips, and the weight of a dangerous bargain heavy on her heart. The map felt like a burning coal in her pocket, a promise of trouble and a test of a loyalty she thought long dead. Chapter 4. Echoes of a Broken Vow. The first rays of dawn painted the eastern sky a pale, washed-out pink as Clem saddled her horse, a sturdy mare named Bess. The air was crisp and cool, carrying the scent of sage and dust, a familiar aroma that usually calmed her, but today, it did little to settle the unease churning in her stomach. She'd barely slept, her mind replaying her encounter with Jesse, the dangerous bargain they'd struck, the fleeting kiss that had left her lips tingling and her heart aching. She tightened the cinch, her movements practiced and efficient, years of habit masking the turmoil within. She mounted Bess, the leather creaking softly beneath her weight, and turned the mare's head north, towards the abandoned silver mine. The map was tucked securely in her pocket, a tangible reminder of the risky task ahead. As she rode, she tried to push Jesse out of her mind, to focus on the landscape, the familiar landmarks, the rhythm of Bess's hooves on the hard-packed earth. But his image kept intruding, his stormy gray eyes, his slow drawl, the way he'd looked at her in the saloon, a mixture of desperation and something else, something that looked disturbingly like longing. She tried to convince herself that she was doing this for the town, for the sake of justice, to bring down a corrupt sheriff. But she knew, deep down, that there was more to it than that. She was doing this for Jesse, too. Despite everything, despite the hurt and the betrayal, a part of her still cared for him, a part of her that refused to let go of the past, of the girl she'd been and the man she'd loved. The landscape grew increasingly rugged as she rode, the gentle rolling hills giving way to rocky canyons and towering mesas. The sun climbed higher in the sky, casting harsh shadows that danced and shifted with the movement of the clouds. She passed the old abandoned homestead, a crumbling reminder of dreams that had withered and died in the unforgiving desert. It reminded her of her own dreams, the ones she'd shared with Jesse, the ones he'd shattered when he'd ridden out of her life. She reached the foothills of the mountains, the terrain becoming steeper and more treacherous. Bess navigated the rocky path with sure-footed ease, her breath coming in short, sharp puffs. Clem kept a watchful eye on the surroundings, scanning the horizon for any sign of movement, any indication that she was being followed. She remembered the stories Jessie had told her, back when they were young and foolish, stories of hidden canyons and secret trails, of outlaws and renegades, of a life lived on the edge of the law. She'd listened, captivated, her heart filled with a mixture of fear and excitement. She'd never imagined that she'd one day be riding through those same canyons, on a mission for the very outlaw who'd told her those tales. She reached the area marked on the map, a cluster of rocks near the entrance to the abandoned silver mine. The mine itself was a dark, gaping hole in the side of the mountain, a silent testament to the boom and bust cycle of the frontier. She dismounted, tying Bess to a scraggly juniper tree, her hand resting on the reassuring presence of the rifle she'd brought with her, strapped to her saddle. She approached the rocks, her heart pounding in her chest. She followed the instructions on the map, counting paces, searching for the specific markings Jessie had described. She found it a small crevice between two large boulders, almost invisible to the casual observer. She reached into the crevice, her fingers brushing against something hard and cold. She pulled it out, her breath catching in her throat. It was a small, leather-bound pouch, tied tightly with a thong. She untied the thong, her hands trembling slightly, and opened the pouch. Inside, she found a collection of documents, ledgers, receipts, letters, all meticulously detailed, all bearing the names of Sheriff Brody and several prominent businessmen in Redemption. It was damning evidence, proof of Brody's illegal activities, proof that could bring him down. But as she examined the documents, she found something else, something that made her heart stop. It was a small, faded photograph, tucked away in a hidden pocket of the pouch. She pulled it out, her fingers trembling, and stared at it. It was a picture of her, taken 15 years ago, when she was a young, hopeful girl, standing beside Jessie, his arm around her waist, his eyes filled with a love she believed was true. She remembered the day the photograph had been taken, a sunny afternoon in the town square, a traveling photographer capturing a moment of fleeting happiness, a moment that had been shattered just a few weeks later. She stared at the photograph, her heart aching with a mixture of grief and longing. He'd kept it all these years. He'd carried it with him, a reminder of the life he'd left behind, the woman he'd abandoned. Why? Why had he kept it? A wave of emotion washed over her, a complex mixture of anger, sadness, and a treacherous, undeniable flicker of hope. Maybe he hadn't forgotten her. Maybe he had regretted his decision. Maybe, just maybe, there was still a chance for them. But the sound of approaching horses shattered her reverie, pulling her back to the present, to the danger at hand. She quickly tucked the photograph back into the pouch, along with the other documents, and secured it tightly. She grabbed her rifle, her heart pounding in her chest, and took cover behind the rocks, her eyes scanning the horizon. 3 riders appeared, silhouetted against the bright sky. She recognized them immediately: Sheriff Brody and 2 of his deputies. They were heading straight towards her. She was trapped. The broken vow echoed in the silence of the canyon, a reminder of the past and a threat to the present. She had to think, and fast. He hadn't just kept the photo, he'd placed it with the evidence. Why? The question clawed, even as adrenaline surged. Chapter 5. The Price of Freedom, the Cost of Love. Clem flattened herself against the cold rock, the rough surface scraping against her cheek. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. The sound of the approaching horses grew louder, closer. Brody and his deputies were riding at a steady pace, their eyes scanning the landscape, clearly searching for something or someone. She gripped her rifle, her knuckles white, her finger tightening on the trigger. She was a good shot. Years of hunting for the family table had seen to that. But taking on 3 men, especially Brody, was a different matter altogether. She needed a plan, and she needed it fast. She peered through a narrow gap in the rocks, watching as the riders drew nearer. Brody was in the lead, his face set in a grim, determined expression. He was a large man, broad-shouldered and imposing, with a reputation for ruthlessness. His deputies were younger, leaner, but equally dangerous. She considered her options. She could try to shoot her way out, but the odds were stacked against her. She could try to hide, but they were clearly searching this area, and it was only a matter of time before they found her. She could try to surrender, but that was the least appealing option of all. Brody wouldn't hesitate to kill her, especially if he knew she had the evidence. An idea sparked in her mind, a desperate gamble, but it was the only chance she had. She remembered the abandoned silver mine, the dark, gaping hole in the side of the mountain. It was a dangerous place, filled with unstable tunnels and hidden shafts, but it offered a potential escape route. She waited until the riders were almost upon her. Then she made her move. She stepped out from behind the rocks, her rifle raised, and fired a shot into the air. The horses reared, startled by the sudden noise. Brody and his deputies cursed, struggling to control their mounts. Clem used the moment of confusion to her advantage. She turned and ran towards the entrance of the mine, her boots slipping on the loose gravel. After her, Brody roared, his voice echoing through the canyon. She plunged into the darkness of the mine, the sudden change from bright sunlight to near total blackness disorienting. She stumbled, nearly falling, but she regained her balance and kept running, her hand brushing against the cold, damp wall of the tunnel. She could hear the shouts of Brody and his deputies behind her, their voices echoing through the labyrinthine passages. They were following her, but the darkness and the unfamiliar terrain were slowing them down. She ran deeper into the mine, her lungs burning, her legs aching. She had no idea where she was going, but she knew she couldn't stop. She had to keep moving to stay ahead of them. She came to a fork in the tunnel, two paths diverging into the darkness. She hesitated, unsure which way to go. She chose the left-hand path, a blind guess, and continued running. The tunnel narrowed, forcing her to slow down. She could hear the sound of dripping water, the faint creak of timbers, the unsettling silence of the deep earth. She felt a growing sense of claustrophobia, a primal fear of being trapped underground. She rounded a corner and saw a faint glimmer of light ahead. She ran towards it, her heart filled with a surge of hope. She emerged from the tunnel into a large, open cavern, the ceiling high above her head, a small opening in the roof, letting in a shaft of sunlight. But her hope was short-lived. Standing in the center of the cavern, blocking her path, was Jesse. He was leaning against a wooden support beam, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. He wasn't surprised to see her. He'd been waiting for her. "Jesse," she gasped, her voice a mixture of relief and confusion. "What are you doing here?" He pushed himself off the beam and walked towards her, his eyes scanning her face. "I knew you'd come this way," he said. "It's the only way out." "But Brody and his deputies, they're right behind me," she said, her voice breathless. He nodded. "I know. I heard the shot. We need to get out of here," she said, her voice urgent. "They'll be here any minute." He shook his head. "There's no time," he said. "We'll have to fight them here." Clem stared at him, her heart sinking. "Fight them? Here? Are you crazy?" He smiled, a grim, determined smile. "Maybe," he said. "But it's our best chance. This cavern is a natural choke point. We can use that to our advantage." He reached into his saddlebag, which was lying on the ground nearby, and pulled out a rifle and a box of ammunition. He handed the rifle to her. "You take this," he said. "You're a better shot than I am." Clem took the rifle, her hand trembling slightly. She checked the load, her movements automatic, her mind racing. She was trapped in a dark, abandoned mine, with the man she'd once loved, about to face a showdown with a corrupt sheriff and his deputies. It was a scene straight out of one of Jesse's outlaw tales, a scene she'd never thought she'd be living. The sound of approaching voices echoed through the tunnel, growing louder. Brody and his deputies were close. "Get ready," Jesse said, his voice low and calm. "They're coming." Clem raised her rifle, her finger tightening on the trigger. She looked at Jesse, his face illuminated by the shaft of sunlight, his eyes filled with a steely determination. He was an outlaw, a gunslinger, a man who lived on the edge. But he was also the man she'd loved, the man who had come back into her life, the man she was now fighting alongside. The price of freedom, she realized, was often paid in blood. And the cost of love? That was a debt she was still trying to calculate, a debt that might be paid with her very life, in the heart of a forgotten mine. The echoes of their past, the weight of their present, and the uncertainty of their future collided in the echoing silence. Chapter 6. Scars Beneath the Surface. The first deputy burst into the cavern, his rifle raised. Jesse reacted instantly, firing a shot that sent the man sprawling backwards into the tunnel. The second deputy followed close behind, firing wildly. Clem ducked behind a pile of rubble, returning fire, her shot finding its mark. The deputy cried out, clutching his arm, and retreated back into the darkness. Brody appeared at the entrance to the cavern, his face contorted with rage.
"Slade," he roared.
"You can't hide from me forever. You're a dead man. Come and get me, Brody." Jesse shouted back, his voice defiant. "You and your crooked deputies." A tense standoff ensued, punctuated by sporadic gunfire. Clem and Jesse used the cover of the rubble and the support beams to their advantage, moving quickly and keeping low. Brody and his remaining deputy, pinned down at the entrance to the tunnel, fired blindly into the cavern, their bullets ricocheting off the rock walls. "We can't stay here forever," Jesse, Clem said, her voice strained. "We're running out of ammunition." "I know," Jesse said, his brow furrowed in concentration. "We need a plan." He glanced around the cavern, his eyes searching for an escape route, a way out of this seemingly impossible situation. He spotted a narrow crevice in the far wall, partially hidden behind a large boulder. It was a long shot, but it might be their only chance. "See that crevice?" he said, pointing. "It might lead to another tunnel, a way out of here."
"Might?"
Clem said, her voice skeptical. "It could be a dead end." "It's a risk we have to take," Jesse said. "It's better than staying here and waiting for Brody to finish us off." He fired a few more shots towards the tunnel entrance, providing cover for Clem.
"Go," he said.
"I'll cover you." Clem hesitated for a moment, then nodded. She scrambled across the open space, dodging bullets, and reached the crevice. She squeezed through the narrow opening, her heart pounding in her chest. Jesse followed close behind, firing a final shot before disappearing into the crevice. The tunnel beyond was narrow and winding, barely wide enough for them to crawl through. They moved slowly, carefully, their bodies brushing against the cold, damp rock. They could hear Brody's shouts behind them, growing fainter as they moved deeper into the tunnel. He was still searching for them, but he hadn't found the crevice yet. The tunnel opened into another, smaller cavern. There was no visible exit, no sign of another passage. Clem felt a wave of despair wash over her. They were trapped. "It's a dead end," she said, her voice filled with resignation. Jesse didn't respond. He was examining the walls of the cavern, his fingers tracing the rough surface of the rock. He stopped at a section of the wall that looked slightly different, the rock a slightly lighter color. "There's something here," he said, his voice excited. "I think this is a false wall." He pushed against the wall, his muscles straining. The rock didn't budge. He tried again, putting all his weight behind it. This time, there was a faint grinding sound, and a section of the wall shifted inward, revealing a narrow opening. "I knew it," Jesse said, a triumphant grin spreading across his face. "There's always a way out, Clem. You just have to know where to look." They squeezed through the opening, finding themselves in another tunnel, this one wider and straighter than the last. They ran, their lungs burning, their legs aching, putting as much distance as possible between themselves and Brody. They finally emerged from the mine, blinking in the bright sunlight. They were on the far side of the mountain, miles from where they'd entered. They were safe for now. They collapsed onto the ground, exhausted and relieved. Clem leaned against a rock, her body trembling with exhaustion. Jesse sat beside her, his breathing ragged. "We made it," she said, her voice barely a whisper. He nodded, his eyes still scanning the surroundings. wary of any pursuit.
We did, he said.
But it's not over yet. We still have to get that evidence to the authorities. Clem reached into her pocket and pulled out the leather pouch, still clutched tightly in her hand. She'd almost forgotten about it, in the heat of the escape. We will, she said, her voice firm. We'll finish what we started. She looked at Jesse, his face streaked with dirt and grime, his clothes torn and dusty. He looked exhausted, but there was a spark of determination in his eyes, a resilience that she admired. Why did you keep the photograph, Jesse? She asked, the question that had been nagging at her since she'd found it. He looked at her, his expression softening. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the faded photograph, the one of them together, 15 years ago. He stared at it for a long moment, his fingers tracing the outline of her younger face. Because it was the only thing I had left of you, he said softly. A reminder of a time when things were simpler. A reminder of the woman I loved. The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken emotions. Clem felt her heart ache, a mixture of sadness and longing. She tried to forget him, to move on, but the photograph, his words, had brought it all back, the intensity of their youthful love, the pain of their separation. You broke my heart, Jesse, she said, her voice trembling. He nodded, his eyes filled with regret.
I know, he said.
And I'm sorry, Clem.
I'm truly sorry.
He reached out and took her hand, his touch sending a jolt of electricity through her. He looked at her, his eyes searching hers. The scars of their shared past were visible, etched on their faces, woven into the fabric of their lives. But beneath the scars, beneath the pain and the regret, there was something else, something that had survived the years, the distance, the betrayal. A flicker of hope, a spark of something that might, just might, be rekindled. But could she trust him? Could she risk opening her heart to him again, knowing the pain he was capable of inflicting? The answer, she knew, was buried deep within the scars, a truth she wasn't yet ready to face. The silence was a shared acknowledgement of wounds that ran deeper than the mine they'd just escaped. Chapter 7. Riding through the storm. They rode in silence for a long while, the only sounds the steady rhythm of their horses' hooves and the occasional sigh of the wind. The adrenaline of their escape had faded, leaving behind a bone-deep weariness and a lingering tension. Clem kept glancing at Jesse, his profile etched against the vast expanse of the sky, his eyes fixed on the horizon. He seemed lost in thought, his expression unreadable. They were heading towards Tucson, the nearest town with a federal marshal, the only authority Clem trusted to handle Brody's case. It was a long ride, several days' journey across rough terrain, and they needed to be cautious. Brody wouldn't give up easily, and he had allies, men who would be willing to hunt them down. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in vibrant hues of orange and purple, a storm gathered on the horizon. Dark, ominous clouds rolled in, obscuring the last rays of sunlight, casting a premature twilight over the land. The wind picked up, whipping their hair and clothes, carrying the scent of rain and dust. We need to find shelter, Clem said, raising her voice above the wind. There's a storm coming. Jesse nodded, his eyes scanning the landscape. There's an old line shack a few miles ahead, he said. We should be able to reach it before the storm hits. They urged their horses into a faster pace, racing against the approaching darkness. The first fat raindrops began to fall, splattering on the dry earth, releasing the pungent scent of petrichor. The wind howled, whipping the rain into a frenzy, stinging their faces and soaking their clothes. They reached the line shack just as the storm broke in full force. It was a small, dilapidated structure, barely more than a wooden box with a leaky roof, but it offered a semblance of protection from the elements. They dismounted, quickly unsaddling their horses and leading them inside. The shack was dark and damp, the air thick with the smell of mildew and decay. There was a small, rusty stove in one corner, and a pile of firewood stacked beside it. Jesse set about building a fire, his movements quick and efficient. Clem found an old, chipped lantern and lit it, casting a flickering, yellow light that barely pierced the gloom. They huddled around the fire, shivering in their wet clothes, the warmth slowly seeping into their bones. The storm raged outside, the wind howling like a banshee, the rain pounding on the roof, the thunder echoing through the canyon. Clem watched Jesse, his face illuminated by the firelight, his eyes reflecting the flickering flames. He looked tired, but there was a quiet strength about him, a resilience that she found both comforting and unsettling. "Do you think we'll make it to Tucson?" she asked, breaking the silence. He looked at her, his expression serious. "We have to," he said. "It's our only chance." "Brody won't give up," she said, her voice filled with apprehension. "He'll come after us." He nodded. "I know," he said, "but we'll be ready for him." He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a bottle of whiskey. He took a long swig, then offered it to her. She hesitated for a moment, then took the bottle, the familiar burn of the liquid warming her throat. They sat in silence, listening to the storm, the whiskey passing between them. The close confines of the shack, the shared danger, the unspoken emotions, created an intimacy that was both comforting and unsettling. "Why did you come back, Jesse?" Clem asked, the question that had been haunting her since his return. "After all these years, why now?" He looked at her, his eyes filled with a complex mixture of emotions: regret, longing, and something else, something she couldn't quite decipher.
"I told you," he said.
"I needed to set things right, to make amends for the past." "But was that all?" she pressed. "Was there nothing else?" He hesitated for a moment, then sighed. "I missed you, Clem," he admitted, his voice low and husky. "I never stopped thinking about you. I never stopped loving you." The words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of 15 years of silence. Clem felt her heart ache, a mixture of pain and a treacherous, undeniable flicker of hope. She tried to bury her feelings for him, to convince herself that he was nothing but a ghost, a faded memory. But his words, his presence, had brought it all back, the intensity of their youthful love, the pain of their separation. "I don't know if I can trust you, Jesse," she said, her voice trembling. "You hurt me so badly." He reached out and took her hand, his touch sending a shiver down her spine. "I know I did," he said. "And I'm not asking you to forget that. But I'm a different man now, Clem. I've changed." "Can people really change?" she asked, her voice filled with doubt. He smiled, a sad, wistful smile.
"I don't know," he said.
"But I'm trying. I'm trying to be a better man." He looked at her, his eyes searching hers. The storm raged outside, a reflection of the turmoil within them. The small shack, a fragile haven in the midst of the chaos, seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the answer that hung between them, an answer that could either heal the wounds of the past or tear them open anew. The rain lashed against the wooden walls, a relentless rhythm that mirrored the beating of her heart. He hadn't just said he loved her, he'd said he never stopped loving her. The distinction was a chasm, and she wasn't sure she was ready to cross it. Chapter 8. Whispers in the Canyon of Secrets. The storm finally abated as dawn approached, leaving behind a world washed clean and glistening. The air was fresh and cool, carrying the scent of wet earth and pine. Clem and Jesse emerged from the line shack, stretching their stiff limbs and blinking in the bright sunlight. They saddled their horses, their movements silent and efficient, their earlier conversation hanging heavy in the air. The unspoken emotions, the unresolved questions, created a palpable tension between them. They rode in silence for most of the morning, following a narrow, winding trail that led them through a series of canyons. The landscape was breathtaking, towering rock formations casting long shadows, the silence broken only by the occasional cry of a hawk circling overhead. As they rounded a bend in the trail, Jesse suddenly reined in his horse, his body tense, his eyes scanning the surrounding cliffs. "What is it?" Clem asked, her voice alarmed. "I don't like this," he said, his voice low and cautious. "This is a perfect place for an ambush." Clem followed his gaze, her heart pounding in her chest. He was right. The canyon narrowed here, the walls rising steeply on either side, offering numerous hiding places for anyone lying in wait. They dismounted, leading their horses carefully along the narrow trail, their eyes constantly scanning the rocks above. The silence was unnerving, amplifying the sense of danger. Suddenly, a shot rang out, the bullet whizzing past Clem's head, embedding itself in the rock face beside her. She ducked, instinctively seeking cover behind a large boulder. Jesse pulled his rifle, returning fire, his shots echoing through the canyon. "Ambush!" he shouted. "They're up there." More shots rang out, coming from multiple directions. Clem and Jesse were pinned down, trapped in the narrow canyon, with no clear escape route. "We need to get out of here," Clem said, her voice urgent. "I know," Jesse said, his brow furrowed in concentration. "But how?" He scanned the canyon walls, searching for a way out, a path that would lead them to safety. He spotted a narrow ledge, high above them, barely visible against the rock face. It was a risky climb, but it might be their only chance. "See that ledge?" he said, pointing. "We can climb up there, get out of the line of fire." "Are you crazy?" Clem said, her voice incredulous. "It's too steep. We'll fall." "It's our only option," Jesse said. "We can't stay here." He started climbing, his movements quick and agile, his hands finding purchase on the rough rock. Clem hesitated for a moment, then followed him, her heart pounding in her chest. The climb was treacherous, the rock loose and crumbling, the drop below them terrifying. But they kept moving, inching their way upward, their muscles straining, their breath coming in short, sharp gasps. They reached the ledge, collapsing onto the narrow strip of rock, exhausted and relieved. They were out of the direct line of fire, but they were still exposed, vulnerable to attack from above. "Who are they, Jesse?" Clem asked, her voice breathless. "Brody's men?" He shook his head.
"I don't think so," he said.
"These are different. More professional. Mercenaries, maybe." "Mercenaries?" Clem said, her voice filled with alarm. "Who hired them?" Jesse frowned.
"I don't know," he said.
"But it's clear someone wants us dead. Someone who knows about the evidence." The silence that followed was broken only by the distant echo of gunshots. They were trapped, high above the canyon floor, with no clear way out. The whispers in the canyon seemed to carry the weight of their predicament, a reminder of the forces arrayed against them, forces that extended beyond Brody, reaching into a web of corruption and deceit they had yet to fully understand. Clem looked at Jesse. He had his back to the wall, and his face was grim. He met her gaze, and for an instant, his outlaw mask slipped, revealing raw fear and something deeper, protectiveness. And it was aimed at her. The realization settled in her chest, heavy and warm. He would risk his life to protect her. The thought both terrified and moved her. The canyon held its breath, waiting. Chapter 9. The Sheriff's Shadow, the Outlaw's Truth. They remained on the ledge for what felt like an eternity, the silence broken only by the occasional distant gunshot. The sun climbed higher in the sky, beating down on them, the heat reflecting off the rock face. They were exposed, vulnerable, and running out of time. "We can't stay here forever, Jesse," Clem said, her voice strained. "We need to make a move." He nodded, his eyes scanning the canyon below.
"I know," he said.
"But we need a plan. We can't just climb down. We'll be sitting ducks." He studied the terrain, his mind racing, searching for a way out of this seemingly impossible situation. He noticed a narrow, winding path that led down from the ledge, disappearing around a bend in the canyon. It was a risky path, steep and treacherous, but it might offer a chance of escape. "See that path?" he said, pointing. "It might lead us down, out of the line of fire."
"Might?"
Clem said, her voice skeptical. "It could be a dead end. Or worse, it could lead us right back to them."
"It's a risk we have to take," Jesse said.
"It's better than staying here and waiting for them to pick us off." He started down the path, his movements slow and cautious, testing each foothold before putting his weight on it. Clem followed close behind, her heart pounding in her chest, her hands gripping the rough rock. The path was even more treacherous than it looked, the loose gravel slipping beneath their feet, the drop below them terrifying. But they kept moving, inching their way downward, their muscles straining, their breath coming in short, sharp gasps. They reached a point where the path narrowed, forcing them to turn sideways, their bodies pressed against the rock face. They moved slowly, carefully, their hands clinging to the small crevices and protrusions in the rock. Suddenly, a shot rang out, the bullet whizzing past Clem's ear, showering her with fragments of rock. She cried out, losing her grip, her feet slipping on the loose gravel. She felt herself falling, the ground rushing up to meet her. Jesse reacted instantly, grabbing her arm, his grip like iron. He pulled her back, his muscles straining, his feet barely holding their purchase on the narrow path. He hauled her back onto the ledge, her body trembling with shock and fear. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice urgent, his eyes filled with concern. She nodded, her breath coming in ragged gasps. I think so," she said. "Thank you, Jesse. You saved my life." He looked at her, his expression softening. "We look out for each other, Clem," he said. "That's what we do." They continued down the path, their movements even more cautious now, the near-fatal fall a stark reminder of the danger they faced. They finally reached the bottom of the canyon, their legs trembling with exhaustion, their bodies covered in cuts and bruises. They found themselves in a narrow, winding gorge, the walls rising steeply on either side. They followed the gorge, hoping it would lead them out of the canyon, away from their pursuers. As they walked, Clem noticed something glinting in the sunlight, partially hidden beneath a pile of rocks. She stopped, her curiosity piqued. She knelt down and brushed away the rocks, revealing a small, metal box. She opened the box, her heart pounding in her chest. Inside, she found a collection of documents, even more damning than the ones she'd retrieved from the mine. These documents implicated not only Sheriff Brody, but several other prominent figures in the territory, revealing a vast network of corruption and illegal activity. "Jesse, look at this," she said, her voice filled with astonishment. This is bigger than we thought." He examined the documents, his eyes widening in disbelief. "This changes everything," he said. "This goes all the way to the top." He looked at her, his expression grim. "We need to get this to someone we can trust," he said. "Someone who can expose this whole rotten system." "But who?" Clem asked. "Who can we trust?" Jesse was silent for a moment, his mind racing. Then a name came to him, a name from his past, a name he hadn't thought of in years. "There's a man," he said, his voice hesitant. "A former Texas Ranger, now a judge in Santa Fe. Judge Thomas Harding. He's a good man, an honest man. He's the only one I can think of who can handle this." "Santa Fe?" Clem said. "That's even further than Tucson. It'll take us weeks to get there." He nodded. "I know," he said. "But it's our only chance. We can't let this information fall into the wrong hands." The sheriff's shadow seemed to extend even further than they'd imagined, its darkness reaching into the highest echelons of power. But now, they also had a glimpse of the outlaw's truth, a truth that went beyond personal vendettas and reached into a fight for justice, a fight that had unexpectedly become their own. The weight of the discovery and the perilous journey ahead settled upon them. Chapter 10. A dance with danger, a waltz with desire. The decision made, they continued their journey, their destination now Santa Fe. The landscape changed, the rugged canyons giving way to rolling hills and vast, open plains. They rode cautiously, avoiding the main roads, sticking to the less traveled trails, always wary of pursuit. They reached a small, dusty town, nestled in a valley, a welcome respite from the harsh wilderness. They decided to stop for the night, to rest their horses and replenish their supplies. They found a small, unassuming inn on the outskirts of town, hoping to avoid attracting unwanted attention. The innkeeper, a stout, middle-aged woman with a kind face, greeted them warmly, offering them a room and a hot meal. They accepted gratefully, their bodies aching with exhaustion, their stomachs rumbling with hunger. After settling their horses in the stable, they entered the inn's common room, a cozy space with a crackling fireplace and a few scattered tables. A handful of locals were gathered around the fire, talking and laughing, their voices a welcome distraction from the tension of the past few days. Clem and Jessie sat at a table in a corner, keeping to themselves, their eyes constantly scanning the room. They ate their meal in silence, the food simple but nourishing, restoring their strength. As the evening wore on, the common room grew quieter, the locals gradually drifting off to bed. Clem and Jessie remained at their table, nursing their drinks, the unspoken emotions between them simmering beneath the surface. The innkeeper approached their table, a curious expression on her face. "You two seem a bit on edge," she said, her voice gentle. "Anything I can help with?" Clem and Jessie exchanged a glance. They were hesitant to reveal their situation, to trust anyone, but the innkeeper seemed genuinely concerned. "We've had a bit of trouble," Jessie said, his voice vague. "We're trying to avoid attracting attention." The innkeeper nodded, understandingly. "This is a quiet town," she said. "But word travels fast, especially about strangers." She paused, then added, "There's a dance tonight at the town hall. It might be a good way to blend in, to seem less conspicuous." Clem and Jessie exchanged another glance. The idea of a dance seemed absurd, given their situation, but the innkeeper had a point. It might be a way to allay suspicion, to appear less like fugitives on the run. "We'll think about it," Jessie said, his voice noncommittal. The innkeeper smiled.
"Suit yourselves," she said.
"But it might do you good to relax a little. You both look like you could use a bit of fun." She left them alone, and they returned to their silence. The idea of the dance lingered in the air, a tempting distraction from the danger that surrounded them. "What do you think?" Clem asked, breaking the silence. "Should we go?" Jessie hesitated for a moment, then shrugged. "It might not be a bad idea," he said. "It could help us blend in," as the innkeeper said. He looked at her, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. "And it might be nice," he added, his voice softer, "to have a bit of normalcy for a change." Clem felt a warmth spread through her, a surprising response to his words. The idea of dancing with Jessie, of holding him close, of forgetting, for a few precious hours, the danger that surrounded them, was undeniably appealing. They decided to go. They changed into the best clothes they had, Clem donning a simple, but elegant, dress she'd packed for the journey, Jessie changing into a clean shirt and a pair of dark trousers. They walked to the town hall, the sounds of music and laughter drifting through the night air. The hall was brightly lit, decorated with colorful streamers and lanterns. A small band was playing a lively tune, and couples were swirling across the dance floor. They entered the hall, feeling a bit awkward and out of place. They stood near the entrance, watching the dancers, unsure of what to do. Jessie turned to Clem, a shy smile on his face. "May I have this dance?" he asked, his voice hesitant. Clem felt her heart flutter, a surprising response to his simple request. She nodded, her own smile mirroring his. He took her hand, his touch sending a shiver down her spine, and led her onto the dance floor. They began to dance, a slow waltz, their bodies moving together in a graceful rhythm. As they danced, Clem felt the tension melt away, replaced by a sense of ease and comfort. She looked into Jessie's eyes, his stormy gray gaze filled with a tenderness she hadn't seen in years. She felt herself drawn to him, the years of hurt and betrayal fading into the background, replaced by the undeniable connection that still existed between them. They danced for hours, lost in their own world, oblivious to the other couples around them. They talked, softly, sharing stories, memories, and dreams. They laughed, genuine laughter, the sound a welcome balm to their weary souls. As the evening drew to a close, the band played a final, slow song. Jessie held Clem close, his arms wrapped around her waist, her head resting on his shoulder. They swayed to the music, their bodies moving as one, their hearts beating in unison. It was a dance with danger, a waltz with desire, a moment of fragile peace in the midst of a storm. The dance and the night ended, but as they stepped out of the hall, hand in hand, a figure emerged from the shadows. Recognition flickered, and cold reality crashed back. The dance had been an illusion. The danger was still very, very real. Chapter 11. The Unforgiven Past. The figure stepped into the moonlight, and Clem's breath caught in her throat. It was a man she recognized from Redemption, one of Brody's known associates, a weasel-faced man named Sneed. He was smirking, a cruel glint in his eyes, and he held a pistol loosely at his side, but pointed in their general direction. Well, Sneed drawled, his voice dripping with malice. Look what we have here. The lovebirds, out for a stroll. Jesse pushed Clem behind him, shielding her with his body, his hand moving towards the gun tucked into his waistband. What do you want, Sneed? Jesse asked, his voice low and dangerous. The sheriff sends his regards, Sneed said, his smirk widening. He wants his property back.
And he wants you dealt with.
We're not going back to Redemption, Jesse said, his voice unwavering. You don't have a choice, Sneed said. You're coming with me, one way or another. He raised his pistol, aiming it directly at Jesse. Clem felt a surge of fear, a desperate need to protect him. Don't do it, Sneed, Clem shouted. It's not worth it. Sneed ignored her, his eyes fixed on Jesse. Any last words, Slade? He sneered. Before Jesse could respond, a voice rang out from the shadows. Drop the gun, Sneed. A figure emerged from the darkness, a tall, imposing man with a stern face and a badge pinned to his chest. It was the town marshal, alerted by the commotion. He held a rifle, aimed directly at Sneed. Sneed hesitated, his eyes darting between Jesse and the marshal. He knew he was outgunned, outnumbered. He slowly lowered his pistol. I was just leaving, Sneed stammered, his bravado gone. Get out of my town, the marshal said, his voice cold and hard. And don't come back. Sneed turned and fled, disappearing into the darkness. The marshal turned to Jesse and Clem, his expression questioning. Are you two all right? He asked. We're fine, Jesse said, his voice steady. Thanks to you. The marshal nodded, his eyes studying them closely. You two seem to be attracting trouble, he said. What's going on? Jesse and Clem exchanged a glance. They knew they couldn't reveal the whole truth, not yet.
It's a long story, Jesse said.
A personal matter. The marshal didn't press them, but he didn't seem entirely convinced. Just be careful, he said. This is a peaceful town. We don't want any trouble here. He left them alone, and they returned to the inn, their hearts pounding, their earlier mood shattered. The encounter with Sneed had been a stark reminder of the danger they faced, the relentless pursuit of Brody and his allies. They reached their room, closing the door behind them, locking it securely. They stood in silence, the tension thick in the air. That was close, Clem said, her voice trembling. Jesse nodded, his face grim.
Too close, he said.
We need to be more careful. He sat down on the edge of the bed, his shoulders slumped, his expression weary. Clem sat beside him, her hand reaching out to touch his arm, a gesture of comfort. I'm tired of running, Jesse, she said, her voice filled with exhaustion. I'm tired of being afraid. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a sadness she hadn't seen before.
I know, he said.
Me too. He paused, then added, I never wanted this for you, Clem. I never wanted to drag you into this mess.
It's not your fault, she said.
I made my own choices. But I brought the danger, he said. I brought the past back with me. He looked at her, his eyes searching hers. I should have stayed away, he said, his voice filled with regret. I should have let you live your life in peace. Don't say that, Jesse, she said, her voice urgent. It's not that simple. She reached out and took his hand, her fingers intertwining with his.
We're in this together now, she said.
We'll face it together. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and longing. He leaned in and kissed her, a slow, tender kiss, a kiss that spoke of shared pain, shared fear, and a shared hope for a future they might never have. But as they kissed, a memory surfaced in Clem's mind, a memory she'd suppressed for years, a memory of the night Jesse had left her. She remembered the note he'd left behind, a hastily scrawled message that had broken her heart. She remembered the words, the cruel, dismissive words that had convinced her he'd never truly loved her. She pulled away from him, her eyes filled with a sudden doubt, a flicker of the old pain and resentment. "The note," she said, her voice trembling. "The note you left me 15 years ago. What did it say, Jessie? Tell me the truth." He looked at her, his expression confused.
"The note?" he said.
I don't remember. Don't lie to me, Jessie," she said, her voice rising. "I remember it. I remember every word. You said you were leaving, that you didn't love me, that I was just a distraction." He stared at her, his eyes widening in disbelief. "I never said that," he said, his voice firm. "I would never say that." "But you did," she insisted. "I read it with my own eyes." He shook his head, his expression adamant. "I don't know what note you're talking about, Clem," he said. "But I never wrote those words. I swear to you." The unforgiven past had risen between them, a ghost that refused to be silenced, a barrier to the fragile trust they were trying to build. The truth, it seemed, was buried beneath layers of deception and misunderstanding, a truth they needed to uncover if they were to have any chance of a future together. And the doubt, cold and sharp, pierced through the warmth of the moment. Chapter 12. Blood on the Horizon. The accusation hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Jessie stared at Clem, his face a mask of disbelief and hurt. Clem watched him, her own emotions a tangled mess of doubt, anger, and a lingering, painful love. "You're lying," Clem said, her voice trembling, but filled with a desperate need to believe her own memory, her own pain. "You have to be." "I'm not lying, Clem," Jessie said, his voice firm, his eyes unwavering. "I don't know what note you read, but it wasn't for me. I would never have written those words. I loved you." "Then what happened?" Clem asked, her voice pleading. "What happened that night, Jessie? Tell me the truth." "The whole truth." He sighed, running a hand through his hair, his expression weary. He looked away, his gaze fixed on the floor, as if searching for the words, for the courage to reveal the secrets he'd kept buried for so long. "It was Brody," he finally said, his voice low and rough. "It was always Brody." Clem frowned, confused. "Brody? What does Brody have to do with this?" "He was the one who forced me to leave," Jessie said. "He threatened you, Clem. He said if I didn't leave Redemption, if I didn't disappear, he'd hurt you." Clem stared at him, her mind reeling. "He threatened me? Why?" "Because he wanted you," Jessie said, his voice bitter. "He'd always wanted you. And he knew I was the only thing standing in his way." Clem felt a chill run down her spine. She remembered Brody, even back then, his leering glances, his unwelcome advances. She'd always dismissed him as a harmless nuisance, a pathetic bully. She'd never imagined he was capable of such cruelty, such manipulation. "So you left," Clem said, her voice barely a whisper. "To protect me." Jessie nodded, his eyes filled with a deep, abiding sadness. "I had no choice," he said. "I couldn't risk your life. I couldn't let him hurt you." "But the note," Clem said, her voice still filled with doubt. "The words I wrote a note," Jessie said. "But it wasn't the one you read. I wrote that I was leaving, that I had to go, but I promised I'd come back for you. I hid it in your favorite book, Wuthering Heights, the one you always kept by your bedside." Clem's heart skipped a beat. She remembered the book, the worn, leather-bound copy she'd cherished since childhood. She'd never thought to look there. "Brody must have found it," Jessie continued. "He must have replaced it with his own note, a note designed to break your heart, to make you hate me." Tears welled up in Clem's eyes, tears of regret, of anger, of a love that had been stolen, manipulated, twisted into something ugly. She'd spent 15 years believing a lie, hating Jessie for a betrayal he'd never committed. "Oh, Jessie," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "I am so sorry." He reached out and took her hand, his touch gentle, reassuring. "It's not your fault, Clem," he said. "You didn't know." They sat in silence, the weight of the revelation heavy between them. The truth, finally revealed, had shattered the wall of resentment and misunderstanding that had separated them for so long. But the relief was short-lived. A sudden pounding on the door shattered the quiet, a frantic, desperate hammering that sent a jolt of fear through them. "Open up. It's the marshal," a voice shouted. Jesse and Clem exchanged a look of alarm. They knew this wasn't a social call. Jesse opened the door, his hand resting on his gun. The marshal stood in the hallway, his face grim, his eyes filled with urgency. "There's been trouble," the marshal said.
"Brody's men. They're here."
"They're attacking the town." Clem gasped. "Attacking the town?"
"Why?"
"They're looking for you too," the marshal said. "They know you're here, and they're not going to leave until they find you." He looked at Jesse, his expression serious.
"You need to leave," he said. "Now.
"Get out of town before they find you." "But the townspeople," Clem said. "We can't just leave them to face Brody's men alone." "We'll handle it," the marshal said. "We're armed. We'll defend ourselves." He paused, then added, "But you two are the targets. You need to get out of here. It's the only way to protect yourselves and the town." Jesse nodded, his face set in a determined expression. "We'll go," he said. "But we'll be back. We'll help you fight Brody once we get this evidence to the authorities." They grabbed their belongings, their movements quick and efficient. They slipped out of the inn, avoiding the main street, heading towards the stable. As they reached the stable, they saw them. Brody's men, a dozen or more, heavily armed, riding through the town, shooting and shouting, terrorizing the townspeople. Blood was already on the horizon, the sky stained red with the setting sun, and the violence that had erupted. They were trapped, caught in the crossfire, with no clear escape route. The town they'd sought refuge in had become a battleground, and the fight for justice had suddenly become a fight for survival. The past and the present had collided, and the future was uncertain, written in the smoke and fire of Brody's ruthless attack. Chapter 13. Letters from a Lost Life. They hid in the shadows of the stable, watching the chaos unfold. Brody's men were systematically searching the town, going from building to building, their faces grim, their guns drawn. The townspeople were fighting back, but they were outgunned, outnumbered. "We need to get out of here," Jesse, Clem whispered, her voice urgent. "They'll find us if we stay." He nodded, his eyes scanning the surroundings, searching for an escape route. "I know," he said. "But how?" "They're everywhere." He spotted a narrow alleyway behind the stable that led out of town. It was a risky path, exposed and vulnerable, but it might be their only chance. "We'll take the alley," he said. "It's our best bet." They crept along the alleyway, keeping low, their bodies pressed against the walls. They could hear the shouts and gunshots behind them, the sounds of the battle raging in the town. They reached the end of the alley, peering cautiously around the corner. The coast seemed clear. They made a dash for it, running across the open ground, heading towards the outskirts of town. Suddenly, a shot rang out, and Jesse cried out, clutching his arm. He stumbled, nearly falling, but Clem caught him, supporting his weight. "Jesse, are you all right?" she asked, her voice filled with alarm. "I'm hit," he said, his face contorted with pain. "But it's just a graze. I can still move." They kept running, reaching the cover of a small grove of trees, just outside of town. They collapsed onto the ground, breathless and exhausted. Clem examined Jesse's arm. The bullet had grazed his flesh, leaving a bloody furrow, but it wasn't a serious wound. She tore a strip of cloth from her dress and bandaged it, her hands trembling. "We need to get to a doctor," she said. "That wound needs to be properly cleaned and dressed." "There's no time," Jesse said, his voice strained. "Brody's men will be searching for us. We need to keep moving." He struggled to his feet, his face pale, his body weakened by the blood loss. Clem supported him, helping him to walk. They continued their journey, their pace slow and arduous, Jesse's injury slowing them down. They followed a narrow, winding trail that led them through the hills, away from the town, away from Brody's reach. As night fell, they found a small, secluded cave, hidden amongst the rocks. They decided to stop for the night, to rest and recover. Clem built a small fire, the flickering flames providing warmth and light. She helped Jesse settle down, making him as comfortable as possible. She sat beside him, watching him, her heart aching with worry. He was weak and pale, his breathing shallow. She feared for his life. "Jesse," she said, her voice soft. "I need to tell you something." He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of pain and tenderness. "What is it, Clem?" he asked. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the small, faded photograph, the one she'd found in the hidden cache. She held it out to him. "I found this," she said. "In the mine. You kept it all these years." He took the photograph, his fingers tracing the outline of her younger face. He smiled, a sad, wistful smile. "I told you," he said. "It was the only thing I had left of you." "I believe you now, Jesse," she said. "About the note. About everything." She paused, then added, "I found something else, too. In the inn. In my room." She reached into her bag and pulled out a small, leather-bound book. It was her copy of Wuthering Heights, the one she'd kept by her bedside all those years ago. She opened the book, her hands trembling, and found a folded piece of paper, tucked between the pages. It was a letter, written in Jesse's handwriting. The ink faded, the paper yellowed with age. She unfolded the letter, her heart pounding in her chest, and began to read. The words were a testament to his love, his regret, his promise to return. It was the letter he'd written 15 years ago, the letter Brody had stolen, the letter that would have changed everything. Tears streamed down Clem's face as she read, the words a balm to her wounded heart, a confirmation of the love she'd doubted for so long. She finished reading, her voice choked with emotion. "You did love me," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "You always loved me." He reached out and took her hand, his touch gentle, reassuring. "I always will," he said. The letters, from a lost life, had finally bridged the chasm of years and lies, revealing the truth that had been hidden for so long. But the truth, while healing, also brought with it the stark reality of their present danger. The past was settled, but the future remained a dangerous, uncertain path. They were wounded, hunted, and far from safe, with a long journey still ahead. Chapter 14. The Heart's Reckoning. The night passed slowly, filled with fitful sleep and the constant fear of discovery. Jesse's wound, though not life-threatening, was causing him considerable pain, and he was weak from blood loss. Clem tended to him as best she could, changing his bandage, offering him water, her heart heavy with worry. As dawn broke, painting the sky in pale hues of pink and orange, they knew they had to keep moving. They couldn't stay in the cave, exposed and vulnerable. They needed to reach Santa Fe, to deliver the evidence to Judge Harding, to expose Brody's corruption and bring him to justice. They set off, their pace slow and arduous, Jesse leaning heavily on Clem for support. They followed a narrow, winding trail that led them through the mountains, the terrain rugged and unforgiving. As they walked, Clem couldn't help but reflect on the events of the past few weeks. Jesse's return had turned her life upside down, shattering the fragile peace she'd built, forcing her to confront the ghosts of her past. But it had also brought her a truth she'd long denied, a truth about Jesse's love, about Brody's betrayal, about the enduring power of the human heart. She looked at Jesse, his face pale and drawn, his body weakened by his injury, but his eyes still filled with that familiar spark of determination, that unwavering resolve. He was an outlaw, a gunslinger, a man who had lived a life of danger and violence. But he was also the man she'd loved, the man who had risked his life to protect her, the man who had never stopped loving her. "Jessie," she said, her voice soft. "Do you regret it?" He looked at her, his brow furrowed in confusion. "Regret what?" he asked. "Everything," she said. "Coming back, getting involved in all of this, risking your life." He stopped, turning to face her, his eyes searching hers. "No," he said, his voice firm. "I don't regret it. I regret the years we lost, the pain I caused you. But I don't regret coming back. I had to set things right. I had to see you again." He reached out and touched her cheek, his fingers tracing the lines of her face, his touch gentle, tender. "I never stopped loving you, Clem," he said. Not for a single day. Tears welled up in Clem's eyes, tears of relief, of gratitude, of a love that had endured the test of time and betrayal. She leaned into his touch, her heart aching with a mixture of sorrow and joy. "I love you too, Jessie," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "I always have." They stood there, in the middle of the wilderness, their bodies close, their hearts intertwined, the vast expanse of the sky above them, the rugged mountains surrounding them, bearing witness to their reunion, their reconciliation. But the moment was fleeting. They knew they couldn't linger. They had to keep moving, to reach Santa Fe, to complete their mission. They continued their journey, their steps lighter now, their hearts filled with a renewed sense of hope, a shared determination to face whatever challenges lay ahead. They were wounded, hunted, and far from safe, but they were together, and that was all that mattered. As they walked, Clem began to think about the future, about what might happen after they delivered the evidence, after Brody was brought to justice. She imagined a life with Jessie, a life free from danger, a life filled with peace and happiness. It was a fragile dream, a distant hope, but it was a dream she was determined to hold on to, a dream she was willing to fight for. She knew it wouldn't be easy. Jessie had a past, a reputation, a life that would be hard to escape. But she believed in him. She believed in his ability to change, to build a new life, a life worthy of the love they shared. The heart's reckoning was complete. The past had been faced, the truth revealed, the love reaffirmed. But the journey was far from over. The path ahead was still fraught with danger, with uncertainty, with the looming threat of Brody's revenge. They had found each other again, but they still had to fight for their future, a future that hung precariously in the balance, a future that depended on their courage, their resilience, and their unwavering love for each other. The mountains loomed, silent witnesses to their struggle. Chapter 15. Trapped between two worlds. The journey to Santa Fe was grueling. They traveled by day and hid by night, avoiding towns and settlements, sticking to the less traveled trails. Jessie's wound, though healing, continued to slow them down, and they were constantly wary of pursuit. They were running low on supplies, their food dwindling, their water scarce. They reached a small, isolated trading post, nestled in a valley, a welcome sight after days of relentless travel. They decided to risk stopping, to replenish their supplies and gather information. The trading post was a rustic, ramshackle building, a hub for trappers, prospectors, and the occasional traveler. A handful of rough-looking men were gathered around a table, talking and drinking, their eyes wary and suspicious. Clem and Jessie entered cautiously, their hands resting on their guns, their senses alert. The trader, a grizzled old man with a weathered face and a shrewd gaze, greeted them with a nod. "What can I do for you folks?" he asked, his voice gruff. "We need supplies," Jessie said. "Food, water, ammunition." The trader looked them over, his eyes lingering on Jessie's bandaged arm. "You two look like you've been through hell," he said. "What's your story?" Jessie and Clem exchanged a glance. They were hesitant to reveal their situation, to trust anyone, but they needed supplies and they needed information. "We're heading to Santa Fe," Jessie said, his voice vague. "We've had some trouble along the way." The trader nodded, understandingly. "Trouble's easy to find in these parts," he said. "Especially these days. Word is, there's a war brewing between Sheriff Brody and some outlaw." Clem and Jessie exchanged another glance, their hearts pounding. The trader's words confirmed their fears. Brody was actively searching for them, and his influence extended far beyond redemption. "We've heard rumors," Jessie said, trying to sound casual. "We're just trying to stay out of it." The trader grunted.
"Smart move," he said. "But it ain't easy.
Brody's got a long reach, and he ain't afraid to use it." He paused, then added, "He's offering a reward. A hefty one. For anyone who brings him information about the outlaw or his woman." Clem felt a chill run down her spine. They were trapped, caught between two worlds, the world of the law, represented by the corrupt Sheriff Brody, and the world of the outlaws, a world Jessie had once belonged to, a world he was now trying to escape. They were fugitives, hunted by both sides, with nowhere to turn, no one to trust. They purchased their supplies, their movements quick and efficient, their eyes constantly scanning the room, wary of any sign of danger. They left the trading post as quickly as they could, heading back into the wilderness, their sense of unease growing with each passing mile. "We need to be careful, Jessie," Clem said, her voice urgent. "Brody knows we're heading to Santa Fe. He'll have men waiting for us." Jessie nodded, his face grim.
"I know," he said.
"We'll have to be even more cautious. We'll have to avoid the main trails, stick to the mountains, travel at night." They changed their route, heading into the higher elevations, the terrain becoming even more rugged and treacherous. They traveled under the cover of darkness, their progress slow and painstaking, the fear of discovery a constant companion. They were exhausted, hungry, and running out of hope. They were trapped between two worlds, with no clear path to safety, no easy way out. The weight of their situation pressed down on them, a heavy burden that threatened to crush their spirits. As they sat around a small, flickering campfire, hidden amongst the rocks, Clem looked at Jessie, his face illuminated by the firelight, his eyes filled with a weariness she'd never seen before. "Do you think we'll make it, Jessie?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He looked at her, his expression softening. He reached out and took her hand, his touch gentle, reassuring.
"We have to," he said.
"We have to believe we will. We've come too far, lost too much, to give up now." He paused, then added, "We're not just fighting for ourselves, Clem. We're fighting for justice, for the truth, for a future free from Brody's corruption." His words gave her strength, a renewed sense of purpose. She squeezed his hand, her heart filled with a mixture of love and determination. They would make it. They had to. They were trapped, yes, but they were not defeated. They would find a way, together. They always did. The fire crackled, a small beacon of hope in the vast, unforgiving darkness, a symbol of their resilience, their unwavering love, and their determination to survive. The two worlds, the law and the outlaw, seemed to be closing in, but within their small circle of firelight, a third world existed. Theirs. Chapter 16. A Flame in the Darkness. The days that followed were a blur of relentless travel, constant vigilance, and gnawing fear. They moved through the mountains like ghosts, avoiding all contact with civilization, their supplies dwindling, their bodies weary, their spirits tested to the limit. Jessie's wound, though healing, continued to plague him, slowing their progress and adding to their vulnerability. One evening, as they were making camp in a small, secluded canyon, they heard the distant sound of horses. They froze, their hearts pounding, their senses alert. "Someone's coming," Clem whispered, her voice urgent. Jessie nodded, his hand moving towards his gun.
"Get down," he said. "Hide."
They scrambled behind a cluster of rocks, peering cautiously through the gaps, watching as a group of riders approached. They were heavily armed, their faces grim, their movements purposeful. Clem recognized one of them, a tall, lean man with a cruel scar across his cheek, one of Brody's most trusted lieutenants. They were being hunted. The riders passed by their hiding place, unaware of their presence, their voices drifting through the night air. Clem and Jessie remained hidden, their bodies tense, their breath held, until the sound of the horses faded away. "That was close," Clem said, her voice trembling with relief. "Too close." Jessie nodded, his face grim. "They're getting closer," he said. "We need to be even more careful." They decided to move on, to put as much distance as possible between themselves and Brody's men. They traveled through the night, guided by the stars, their steps slow and cautious, the darkness their only ally. As dawn approached, they found themselves in a vast, open plain, with no cover, no place to hide. They were exposed, vulnerable, and exhausted. "We need to find shelter," Jessie, Clem said. "We can't keep going like this." He scanned the horizon, his eyes searching for any sign of refuge, any indication of a place to rest, to recover. He spotted a small, flickering light in the distance, a faint glimmer in the vast darkness. There, he said, pointing. What is that? They moved towards the light, their steps slow and hesitant, unsure of what they would find. As they drew closer, they saw that it was a small campfire, burning in front of a dilapidated shack, a lone figure huddled beside it. They approached cautiously, their hands resting on their guns, their senses alert. The figure looked up, startled by their approach. It was an old woman, her face wrinkled and weathered, her eyes filled with a mixture of suspicion and weariness.
Who are you?
She asked, her voice raspy.
What do you want?
We mean you no harm, Jesse said, his voice calm and reassuring. We're travelers, lost and weary. We need shelter, a place to rest. The old woman studied them for a long moment, her eyes piercing, her gaze assessing. She seemed to sense their desperation, their vulnerability. Come in, she said, her voice softening. You can share my fire. They entered the shack, a small, one-room structure, barely furnished, but offering a semblance of protection from the elements. The old woman offered them food and water, simple fare but nourishing, restoring their strength. They sat around the fire, talking softly, sharing stories, the old woman's presence a welcome comfort in the vast, unforgiving wilderness. She told them her name was Martha, and that she lived alone, eking out a meager existence in this remote corner of the world. Clem and Jesse were hesitant to reveal their true identities, to burden the old woman with their troubles, but she seemed to sense their secret, their hidden danger. You're running from something, she said, her voice knowing. I can see it in your eyes. Jesse and Clem exchanged a glance. They knew they couldn't lie to her. We're being hunted, Jesse admitted. By a powerful man, a corrupt sheriff. Martha nodded, her expression unsurprised. There's a lot of corruption in this world, she said. A lot of darkness. She paused, then added, but there's also light. You just have to find it. Her words gave them hope, a renewed sense of purpose. They were weary, hunted, and far from safe, but they weren't alone. There were still good people in the world, people like Martha, who were willing to offer kindness and shelter to strangers in need. As they talked, Martha revealed that she knew a shortcut to Santa Fe, a hidden trail through the mountains, a path known only to a few. It was a dangerous route, she warned, but it would be faster and safer than the main trails. Clem and Jesse exchanged a look of gratitude. Martha's offer was a lifeline, a chance to escape Brody's relentless pursuit, a chance to reach Santa Fe and deliver the evidence that could bring him down. They had found a flame of hope in the darkness, a flicker. The old woman was more than just a kind stranger. She was a potential guide, a key to reaching their destination, a symbol of the resilience of the human spirit in the face of adversity. But accepting her help meant entrusting their lives to a stranger, a leap of faith in a world where trust was a rare and precious commodity. The decision, however, wasn't a difficult one. They had to try. Chapter 17. The Outlaw's Code. The Woman's Heart. They left Martha's shack before dawn, their hearts filled with a mixture of gratitude and apprehension. Martha had given them detailed instructions, drawing a crude map in the dirt, showing them the hidden trail through the mountains, the shortcut to Santa Fe. Be careful, she'd warned them. The path is treacherous, and there are wild animals and other dangers. They followed Martha's map, navigating the rugged terrain, their steps slow and cautious, their senses alert. The trail was narrow and winding, often disappearing altogether, forcing them to rely on their instincts and Jesse's knowledge of the wilderness. As they climbed higher into the mountains, the landscape became even more breathtaking, towering peaks, deep canyons, and vast, open vistas. But the beauty of the surroundings was overshadowed by the constant threat of danger, the ever-present fear of discovery. They traveled for days, their bodies weary, their supplies dwindling, their spirits tested to the limit. Jesse's wound, though healing, continued to cause him pain, and Clem worried about his strength, his ability to continue. One evening, as they were making camp in a small, secluded cave, Jesse seemed to reach a breaking point. He sat down heavily, his shoulders slumped, his expression defeated. I don't know if I can do this, Clem, he said, his voice barely a whisper.
I'm tired. I'm weak. I'm afraid.
Clem sat beside him, her heart aching with compassion. She reached out and took his hand, her touch gentle, reassuring.
You can do this, Jesse, she said.
We can do this. Together. She reminded him of their mission, of the importance of reaching Santa Fe, of exposing Brody's corruption and bringing him to justice. She reminded him of their love, of the bond that had survived years of separation and betrayal, of the strength they drew from each other.
You're not alone, Jesse, she said.
I'm here with you. We'll face this together, whatever happens. Her words, her unwavering faith in him, gave him renewed strength, a surge of determination. He looked at her, his eyes filled with gratitude and love. Thank you, Clem, he said. I don't know what I'd do without you. He stood up, his body still weary, but his spirit renewed. Let's keep moving, he said. We're getting closer. They continued their journey, their steps lighter now, their hearts filled with a renewed sense of hope. They were still in danger, still hunted, still far from safe, but they were together, and that was all that mattered. As they walked, Jesse began to talk about his past, about his life as an outlaw, about the choices he'd made, the mistakes he'd regretted. He told her stories she'd never heard before, stories of daring robberies, of narrow escapes, of the camaraderie and the violence of the outlaw life. He spoke of the code he'd lived by, a code of loyalty, of honor, of protecting the weak and fighting for justice, even outside the bounds of the law. It was a code that had been twisted and corrupted by men like Brody, but it was a code that still held meaning for Jesse, a code he was now trying to reclaim, to live by in a new way. Clem listened, her heart filled with a mixture of fascination and understanding. She saw a different side of Jesse, a side that had been hidden beneath the surface, a side that was both dangerous and admirable. She saw the man he had been, the man he was trying to be, and the man he could become. As they neared Santa Fe, the tension grew. They knew Brody would be waiting for them, that he would have set traps, that he would stop at nothing to prevent them from reaching Judge Harding. They approached the city cautiously, skirting the outskirts, avoiding the main roads, their eyes constantly scanning the surroundings, wary of any sign of danger. They found a small, secluded spot on the edge of town, a place to rest and plan their next move. They knew they couldn't simply walk into the courthouse and hand over the evidence. They needed a plan, a strategy, a way to outsmart Brody and his men. They decided to split up. Jesse would create a diversion, drawing Brody's attention away from the courthouse, while Clem would deliver the evidence to Judge Harding. It was a risky plan, but it was their best chance. The outlaw's code and the woman's heart were intertwined, their fates linked by a shared mission, a shared love, and a shared determination to see justice done. But the plan required a separation, a temporary parting that filled them both with a sense of foreboding, a fear that this might be their last goodbye. The city loomed, a beacon of hope and a den of danger, the final destination of their long and arduous journey. Chapter 18. Crossroads of Fate. They waited until nightfall, the darkness their only ally. They stood on the edge of town, their bodies close, their hearts beating in unison. They looked at each other, their eyes filled with a mixture of love, fear, and determination. Be careful, Clem, Jesse said, his voice low and urgent. Don't take any unnecessary risks. You too, Jesse, she said, her voice trembling.
Please come back to me.
He kissed her a long, tender kiss, a kiss that spoke of promises, of hopes, of a future they might never have. Then, they separated, disappearing into the darkness, each heading towards their designated task, their fates hanging in the balance. Clem made her way towards the courthouse, keeping to the shadows, avoiding the main streets, her heart pounding in her chest. She clutched the leather pouch containing the evidence, her hand trembling, her senses alert. She reached the courthouse, a large, imposing building, dimly lit, seemingly deserted. She slipped inside, her footsteps echoing through the empty corridors. She found Judge Harding's office, the door slightly ajar. She entered cautiously, her hand resting on her gun. The office was dark, the only light coming from a single lamp on the desk. Judge Harding was sitting behind the desk, his back to the door, seemingly engrossed in paperwork. "Judge Harding?" Clem said, her voice hesitant. The figure at the desk turned around, and Clem's blood ran cold. It wasn't Judge Harding. It was Sheriff Brody. He was smirking, a cruel glint in his eyes, a pistol held loosely in his hand. "Looking for someone?" he asked, his voice dripping with malice. Clem froze, her mind reeling. She'd been betrayed. Someone had tipped Brody off. She was trapped. "I knew you'd come," Brody said, his smirk widening. "I knew you wouldn't be able to resist." He stood up, walking towards her, his pistol aimed directly at her heart. "Where's Slade?" he asked, his voice harsh. "Where is he hiding?" Clem didn't answer. She stood her ground, her eyes defiant, her body trembling but resolute. "It doesn't matter," Brody said. "I'll find him. And when I do, I'll kill him. Just like I'm going to kill you." He raised his pistol, his finger tightening on the trigger. Clem closed her eyes, bracing herself for the inevitable. Suddenly, a shot rang out, and Brody cried out, clutching his arm. He dropped his pistol, his face contorted with pain. Clem opened her eyes, her heart pounding. Standing in the doorway, his gun smoking, was Jesse. "I told you not to take any unnecessary risks, Clem," he said, his voice calm but firm. He had followed her, defying their plan, risking his own life to protect her. He couldn't leave her, couldn't let her face Brody alone. Brody scrambled for his pistol, but Jesse was faster. He fired another shot, this one finding its mark. Brody slumped to the floor, lifeless. Jesse rushed to Clem's side, his eyes filled with concern. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice urgent. She nodded, her body trembling with shock and relief.
"I am fine," she said.
"Thanks to you." They stood there, in the dimly lit office, the body of Sheriff Brody lying at their feet, the silence broken only by their ragged breathing. They had faced their greatest fear, their ultimate enemy, and they had survived. But the victory was bittersweet. They knew Brody wasn't the only corrupt official in the territory. He was just a pawn in a larger game, a symptom of a deeper rot. They heard the sound of approaching footsteps, voices shouting, people rushing towards the courthouse. They knew they had to leave, to escape before they were discovered. They slipped out of the courthouse, disappearing into the darkness, leaving behind the chaos, the violence, the corruption they had exposed. They were fugitives again, hunted, with nowhere to turn, no one to Chapter 19. Redemption's price. They fled Santa Fe, their escape as desperate and hurried as their arrival had been cautious. They knew Brody's death would ignite a firestorm, that his allies and co-conspirators would be seeking revenge, that the entire territory would be on high alert. They rode hard, pushing their horses to their limits, heading back towards the familiar, yet perilous, landscape of Arizona. They had the evidence, but they still needed to find someone they could trust, someone with the authority and integrity to bring the remaining corrupt officials to justice. As they traveled, they discussed their options, their hopes, and their fears. They knew they couldn't go back to redemption, not yet. It was too dangerous, too exposed. They needed a safe haven, a place to regroup, to plan their next move. Jesse remembered an old friend, a former lawman named Jedediah Stone, who lived in a secluded cabin in the mountains, far from any town or settlement. Jedediah was a man of unwavering principle, a man who had grown disillusioned with the corruption of the law, a man they might be able to trust. They changed their course, heading towards the mountains, the terrain becoming increasingly rugged and challenging. They traveled for days, their bodies weary, their supplies dwindling, their spirits tested to the limit. They finally reached Jedediah's cabin, a small, rustic structure nestled amongst the trees, overlooking a vast, breathtaking valley. They approached cautiously, their hands resting on their guns, their senses alert. Jedediah emerged from the cabin, his rifle raised, his eyes narrowed in suspicion. He was a tall, grizzled man, his face weathered and lined, his gaze sharp and unwavering. "Hold it right there," he said, his voice gruff. "Who are you, and what do you want?" Jedediah, it's me, Jesse said, his voice calm. Jesse Slade. We need your help. Jedediah lowered his rifle, his eyes widening in recognition. Jesse? Is that really you? What in tarnation are you doing here? Jesse and Clem explained their situation, their journey, their discovery of Brody's corruption, and their desperate need for help. Jedediah listened intently, his expression grim, his eyes filled with a mixture of anger and concern. I knew Brody was a snake, he said, his voice low and harsh. I knew he was up to no good. But I had no idea it went this deep. He looked at Jesse, his gaze piercing. You've gotten yourself into a heap of trouble, son, he said. But you've done the right thing. You've got guts, I'll give you that. He invited them inside, offering them food, water, and shelter. They spent the night in Jedediah's cabin, sharing stories, planning their next move, the weight of their mission heavy upon them. Jedediah agreed to help them. He knew a federal judge in Tucson, a man named Judge Thompson, who was known for his honesty and integrity. Jedediah believed Judge Thompson was the only one who could handle this case, the only one who could bring the remaining corrupt officials to justice. But reaching Tucson would be even more dangerous than reaching Santa Fe. They would be crossing territory controlled by Brody's allies, men who would be actively searching for them, men who would stop at nothing to silence them. Jedediah offered to accompany them, to guide them through the mountains, to protect them as best he could. He was an old man, past his prime, but he was still a skilled tracker and a formidable fighter. They set off the next morning, three unlikely allies, united by a shared purpose, a shared determination to see justice done. They were an outlaw, a shopkeeper, and a retired lawman, an odd trio, but their combined skills and experience made them a force to be reckoned with. As they rode, Clem couldn't help but think about redemption, about her home, her store, her life that had been shattered by Brody's corruption and Jesse's return. She longed to go back, to rebuild, to reclaim what she had lost. What will happen to redemption, Jesse? She asked, her voice filled with concern. After all of this is over? He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and hope. I don't know, Clem, he said, but I hope it can be redeemed. I hope it can become a place of peace, of justice, of happiness. The price of redemption was high, paid in blood, sweat, and tears. They were riding towards an uncertain future, a future that might bring them justice or might bring them death. But they were riding together, their hearts intertwined, their spirits united, their determination unwavering. The mountains stood as silent witnesses, their peaks shrouded in mist, their valleys echoing with the whispers of hope and fear. They knew the final showdown was coming. Chapter 20. The final confrontation of hearts and horizons. They reached the outskirts of Tucson, their journey nearing its end. The city sprawled before them, a mixture of hope and danger, the final destination of their long and arduous quest. They knew they were walking into a trap, that Brody's allies would be waiting for them, that the odds were stacked against them. Jedediah had a plan. He knew a back entrance to the courthouse, a little-used alleyway that led to a side door, a way to avoid the main entrance and the watchful eyes of Brody's men. They waited until nightfall, the darkness their only ally. They left their horses hidden outside of town, approaching the city on foot, their movements cautious, their senses alert. They reached the alleyway, a narrow, dark passage between two buildings, the air thick with the smell of refuse and decay. They slipped inside, their footsteps echoing softly on the cobblestones. They reached the side door of the courthouse, Jedediah trying the handle. It was locked. He pulled out a set of lockpicks, his hands steady despite the tension, his movements practiced and efficient. The lock clicked open, and they slipped inside. The courthouse was dimly lit, seemingly deserted. They moved through the corridors, their footsteps echoing through the empty halls. They reached Judge Thompson's chambers, the door slightly ajar. They entered cautiously, their hands resting on their guns. The office was dark, the only light coming from a single lamp on the desk. Judge Thompson was sitting behind the desk, his back to the door, seemingly engrossed in paperwork. Judge Thompson? Jesse said, his voice hesitant. The figure at the desk turned around, and Clem and Jesse's hearts sank. It wasn't Judge Thompson. It was one of Brody's lieutenants, a man named Kincaid, a cruel and ruthless enforcer. He was smirking, a pistol held loosely in his hand. "Looking for someone?" he asked, his voice dripping with malice. "The judge is indisposed." Several other men emerged from the shadows, surrounding them, their guns drawn. They were trapped. "I knew you'd come," Kincaid said, his smirk widening. "I knew you wouldn't be able to resist. Brody may be dead, but his legacy lives on." And his orders were clear. "You two are to be eliminated." Clem and Jesse stood back to back, their guns drawn, facing their enemies. Jedediah stood beside them, his rifle raised, his face set in a grim, determined expression. "It's over, Slade," Kincaid said. "You can't win." "We'll see about that," Jesse said, his voice calm but firm. A tense standoff ensued, the silence broken only by the ragged breathing of the men, the air thick with anticipation, with the threat of violence. Suddenly, Jedediah lunged forward, firing his rifle, his shot finding its mark. One of Kincaid's men cried out, falling to the ground. The room erupted in chaos. Gunfire exploded, bullets whizzing through the air, shattering glass, splintering wood. Clem and Jesse fired back, their shots accurate and deadly, taking down 2 more of Kincaid's men. Jedediah fought with the ferocity of a cornered lion, his rifle a blur of motion, his aim true. But he was outnumbered, outgunned. A bullet struck him in the chest, and he fell to the ground, his body still. Clem cried out, her heart breaking at the sight of the old lawman, the man who had risked his life to help them, falling in battle. Jesse roared with rage, his grief fueling his fury. He charged forward, firing his pistol, taking down another of Kincaid's men. Clem followed him, her own grief and anger driving her, her shots finding their mark. They fought side by side, their movements synchronized, their love and determination a powerful force. Kincaid fired at Jesse, the bullet grazing his cheek, drawing blood. Jesse stumbled, but he didn't fall. He returned fire, his shot hitting Kincaid squarely in the chest. Kincaid staggered backward, his eyes wide with shock and disbelief, then collapsed to the floor, dead. The remaining men, seeing their leader fall, lost their nerve. They turned and fled, disappearing into the night. Clem and Jesse stood there, in the midst of the carnage, their bodies trembling, their hearts pounding, their clothes stained with blood and sweat. They had won. They had survived. But the victory was hollow, the cost too high. They knelt beside Jedediah, his body still and lifeless. Clem closed his eyes, tears streaming down her face. They had lost a friend, a mentor, a true hero. They were alone again, surrounded by death and destruction, but they had the evidence, and they had each other. They had one final task to complete. They found Judge Thompson, bound and gagged in a back room, unharmed but shaken. They freed him, handing over the evidence, explaining everything. Judge Thompson, his face grim, his eyes filled with a righteous anger, promised to take action, to bring the remaining corrupt officials to justice, to clean up the territory, to restore law and order. The final confrontation had been fought, not just with guns, but with hearts. The horizons were stained with blood, but also with the promise of a new dawn. Redemption's price had been paid, and the future, though uncertain, held a glimmer of hope, a chance for peace, a chance for love, a chance for a life together. They had faced their demons, their enemies, and their own past, and they had emerged, scarred but unbroken, their love a beacon in the darkness. The journey was over. Or was it just beginning? Epilogue. The trials were long and arduous, drawing national attention. The evidence Clem and Jesse had secured, combined with Judge Thompson's unwavering commitment to justice, led to the conviction of numerous corrupt officials, dismantling a network of crime that had stretched across the territory. Redemption, and indeed the entire region, began a slow, painful process of healing. Clem and Jesse returned to Redemption, not as fugitives, but as heroes. The townspeople welcomed them back with open arms, their gratitude and respect evident in every gesture, every word. The shadow of Brody and his regime had been lifted, replaced by a sense of hope, a renewed faith in the possibility of a better future. Clem reopened her general store, the heart of redemption beating once more. The shelves were restocked, the doors were open, and the townsfolk returned, their conversations now filled with cautious optimism, with plans for rebuilding, for moving forward. Jesse, however, struggled to find his place in this new redemption. The outlaw past clung to him like a stubborn shadow, the memories of violence and loss a constant presence. He helped Clem in the store. He worked on the small ranch he'd inherited on the outskirts of town, but he couldn't shake the feeling of being an outsider, of not truly belonging. One evening, as they sat on the porch of Clem's house, watching the sunset paint the sky in vibrant hues of orange and purple, Clem turned to Jesse, her eyes filled with concern. "You're not happy, Jesse," she said, her voice soft. "Are you?" He sighed, running a hand through his hair, his expression troubled. "I don't know, Clem," he said. "I thought I wanted this, a peaceful life, a normal life. But, she prompted gently. "But I feel restless," he admitted, "like a caged animal. I don't know if I can ever truly escape my past." Clem understood. She'd seen the shadows in his eyes, the unspoken yearning for something more, something different. She'd seen the way he'd flinched at sudden noises, the way he'd constantly scanned the horizon, the way he'd gripped his gun at the slightest hint of danger. "Maybe redemption isn't the place for you, Jesse," she said, her voice filled with a sadness that mirrored his own. "Maybe you need something else." He looked at her, his eyes searching hers. "What are you saying, Clem?" he asked. "I'm saying maybe you need to find your own redemption," she said. "Not here, not with me, but somewhere else on your own terms." The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken emotions, with the pain of a potential separation, with the understanding of a love that transcended personal desires. Jesse knew she was right. He couldn't stay in redemption, living in the shadow of his past, constantly reminded of the violence he'd committed, the lives he'd taken. He needed to find his own path, his own purpose, his own way to make amends for the wrongs he'd done. He didn't know where he would go, what he would do, but he knew he had to leave. He had to find a way to use his skills, his experience, his knowledge of the outlaw world for good. He had to find a way to become the man Clem believed he could be. They spent one last night together, a night filled with love, with tears, with promises whispered in the darkness. They held each other close, their bodies intertwined, their hearts aching with the bittersweet knowledge that this might be their final farewell. The next morning, Jesse saddled his horse, his face set in a determined expression, his eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and resolve. He looked at Clem, his gaze lingering on her face, memorizing every detail, every line, every curve. "I love you, Clem," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "I always will." "I love you too, Jesse," she said, her voice trembling. "Go find your peace. Go find your redemption." He mounted his horse, turned towards the horizon and rode away, disappearing into the vast expanse of the desert, leaving Clem standing there, alone, watching him go, her heart filled with a mixture of grief and hope. Years passed. Clem continued to run her store, to be a pillar of the redemption community. She never remarried, her heart forever belonging to the outlaw who had ridden out of her life, seeking his own redemption. One day, a package arrived at the store, addressed to her in a familiar handwriting. She opened it, her hands trembling, her heart pounding. Inside, she found a small, leather-bound book. It was a journal, filled with Jesse's stories, his adventures, his struggles, his triumphs. He had found his redemption. He had become a lawman, a tracker, a protector of the innocent, using his skills to fight for justice, to make amends for his past. He had traveled far and wide, across the territories, bringing criminals to justice, helping those in need, becoming a legend in his own right. He wrote of his loneliness, of his longing for Clem, of his unwavering love for her. He wrote of his hope that one day he might return to redemption, a changed man, worthy of her love, worthy of a peaceful life. But the last page of the journal was blank. Clem closed the book, tears streaming down her face. She didn't know if Jesse was alive or dead, if she would ever see him again. But she knew he had found his peace, his redemption. And she knew that their love, though separated by distance and time, would endure, a timeless bond, a testament to the enduring power of the human heart. She looked out at the horizon, the same horizon he had ridden towards years ago. The sun was setting, painting the sky in the familiar, beautiful hues. And in that sunset, she saw his face, his smile, his love. And she knew, somehow, that he was out there, somewhere, watching the same sunset, thinking of her. And that was enough. The end.